May 27, 1940. The beach at Dunkirk. Captain James Langley stood at the edge of the waterline watching destroyers silhouette against smoke-darkened skies, listening to the rhythmic crash of surf mixing with distant artillery, feeling sand work its way into boots that hadn't been dry in 3 days. Behind him, stretching back toward the town, 300,000 British and French soldiers waited in serpentine queues that disappeared into the dunes. The evacuation was working. Somehow, against all military logic, small boats were pulling men off this exposed beach faster than German artillery could kill them. Langley was 32 years old. A doctor before the war. Captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps after France collapsed. He'd spent the last week moving between aid stations as the British Expeditionary Force contracted toward the coast, treating soldiers with wounds that peacetime medicine would have called catastrophic but that war simply labeled urgent or non-urgent based on whether a man could still walk. The smell of the beach was specific. Salt water and cordite. Burning oil from ships hid offshore. The metallic scent of blood that had soaked into sand and wouldn't wash away with the tide. Men who'd been standing in the shallows for 6 hours waiting their turn to board a destroyer were shivering despite the late spring warmth. Some had dropped their rifles in the surf. Others clutched weapons they'd never fire again, holding on to the last symbol of being soldiers rather than refugees. Langley had watched the evacuation develop its own rhythm over the past 2 days. Naval vessels would pull close to shore, small boats would ferry men to them in batches of 20 or 30, the destroyers would fill to capacity and steam north toward England. Then the cycle would repeat. It was chaotic and magnificent and probably unsustainable. German aircraft appeared periodically to strafe the beaches. Artillery from inland positions dropped shells among the waiting men. But the evacuation continued. His aid station was a warehouse near the harbor, 200 yards from the beach. The building had taken several direct hits. Part of the roof had collapsed. But 3 walls still stood and there was enough space to lay wounded men in rows on the concrete floor. Langley had 4 orderlies and a nurse named Catherine Morrison who'd refused to evacuate when her hospital unit pulled back 3 days earlier. She was 26, from Edinburgh, and had that particular kind of Scottish stubbornness that expressed itself through quiet refusal to acknowledge when situations became impossible. Inside the warehouse, 78 wounded men lay on stretchers and blankets. Some had been there for 3 days. Others had arrived that morning. Langley had divided them into 3 categories using colored tags attached to their uniforms. Green tags meant walking wounded who could board evacuation vessels if space allowed. Yellow tags meant serious injuries requiring surgery and extended recovery. Red tags meant soldiers who would die regardless of medical intervention. The green tagged men had already been sent to the beach. They were lining up with everyone else, taking their chances with the boats. The yellow tagged men were next in priority. If space opened on a hospital ship, these were the soldiers who would fill it. But the red tagged men, there were 23 of them. Gut wounds. Massive head trauma. Shrapnel that had severed major arteries. Men who were unconscious or delirious with infection. Men who would not survive the boat trip to England even if vessels could be found to carry them. Langley knew the mathematics. The War Office had sent clear instructions. Evacuation priority went to able-bodied soldiers who could be returned to combat. The wounded would be evacuated if possible, but not at the expense of combat-effective personnel. The critically wounded, those with no chance of recovery, were to be made comfortable and left behind. It was logical. It was militarily sound. It was absolutely correct from a strategic perspective. It also meant abandoning 23 British soldiers to German captivity while they died of wounds sustained fighting to protect the evacuation. Langley had studied the orders for hours. They were typed on official War Office stationery, signed by a general whose name carried weight. Leave the dying. Save those who can fight again. No medical officer was expected to remain with hopeless cases when that officer's skills could save salvageable wounded. The directive was clear. But Langley kept thinking about Private Thomas Wheeler, 19 years old from Manchester, who had stomach wounds from shell fragments and who had been conscious enough this morning to ask if he was going home. Langley had lied, said yes, absolutely, you'll be on a boat by tomorrow. Wheeler had smiled. Said he wanted to see his mother. Said she made the best meat pies in England. He'd fallen unconscious an hour later and hadn't woken up since. And there was Corporal Davies from Wales, both legs destroyed below the knee by a mine, who kept apologizing for being trouble. Who said he understood if they needed to leave him. Who thanked Langley every time someone adjusted his morphine drip. He was 34 years old. Had 2 daughters. Their pictures were in his uniform pocket, creased and stained but still carefully preserved. 23 men. 23 red tags. 23 cases that military medicine classified as hopeless. Langley stood in the doorway of the warehouse watching the beach. Nurse Morrison came up beside him. She'd been changing dressings for 6 hours straight. Her uniform was stained with blood and iodine. Her hands were steady. The last hospital ship left an hour ago, she said. They took our yellow tags. All of them. That's good, Langley said. The Germans will be here by tomorrow morning. Maybe sooner. Yes. Morrison looked at him. The evacuation office sent word. All medical personnel are ordered to evacuate by nightfall. No exceptions. They're holding spaces on a destroyer for us. Langley didn't respond. He was watching a soldier in the surf, young man maybe 20 years old, who had lost his helmet and was standing waist-deep in water with his hands above his head, waving at a boat that was already full and pulling away. The soldier's face showed the exact moment he understood he wouldn't fit. That he'd have to wait for the next boat. That maybe the next boat wouldn't come. They have 23 red tags, Morrison said quietly. I know. They'll die either way. Whether we're here or not. I know that too. Then we should evacuate. Follow orders. Let someone else make the decision about what happens to them. Langley turned to look at her. Morrison's face was exhausted. 3 days of constant work with minimal sleep and less food. But her eyes were still sharp. Still assessing. She was testing him, he realized. Seeing if he'd actually say it out loud. I can't leave them, Langley said. You mean won't? No, can't. I took an oath. First do no harm. Abandoning dying men because it's militarily convenient qualifies as harm. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Right then. We'll need to organize supplies. Figure out what the Germans will let us keep. Make sure everyone has adequate morphine for when it gets bad. You're staying? Don't be thick, Captain. Of course I'm staying. Someone has to keep you from doing something stupidly heroic like trying to operate without assistance. Langley felt something unlock in his chest. Relief perhaps. Or just recognition that the decision, once made, was irreversible. They would stay. They would care for 23 dying men while 300,000 soldiers escaped. They would become prisoners of war instead of going home. There was a military term for what they were doing. Rearguard action, though typically that referred to combat troops who stayed behind to cover a withdrawal. But the principle was identical. Someone had to stay. Someone had to hold the line. Someone had to make sure that the retreat, when it came, wasn't a rout. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon. The queues on the beach were thinning as more boats arrived. Artillery shells still fell periodically, still killed men waiting to be rescued. But the evacuation was working. The British Expeditionary Force was escaping. Most of it, anyway. Langley went back inside the warehouse. 23 men lay in rows. Some unconscious. Some moaning. Some quiet with the particular stillness that comes just before death. He moved between them, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, administering morphine when pain broke through. Morrison worked beside him. Neither spoke about the decision they'd made. Neither mentioned the destroyer that would leave port in 3 hours with empty spaces reserved for medical personnel who wouldn't be aboard. Outside, the sound of the evacuation continued. Engines. Voices. Surf. The rhythmic industrial process of moving an army across water. Inside the warehouse, 23 men breathed in uneven patterns. And 2 people who could have escaped chose instead to stay. May 28, 1940. Thought. The shelling stopped at first light. Not gradually but all at once, as if someone had shut off a tap. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the bombardment. It meant the Germans were moving into position. It meant they no longer needed artillery because they were close enough for rifles. Langley had slept for perhaps 2 hours, dozing in a chair near Private Wheeler's stretcher. When he woke, Morrison was standing in the doorway watching the street outside. Her posture was tense. Alert. They're here, she said. How many? I saw a motorcycle with a sidecar go past. Then a truck. Infantry following on foot. They're not rushing. They know there's nothing left to fight. Langley stood, working blood back into legs that had gone numb. His back ached from sleeping in the chair. His hands were steady, but he noticed they were shaking slightly when he tried to button his uniform jacket. Fear or exhaustion or some combination. He'd been functioning on adrenaline for 3 days. Now the adrenaline was depleting and what remained was just baseline animal awareness that predators were close. What do we do? Morrison asked. We wait. Make sure everyone knows to stay calm. No sudden movements when the Germans enter. And if they decide to shoot us? Then they shoot us. But I don't think they will. There's no tactical value in executing medical personnel. And the Geneva Convention should protect us. Morrison made a sound that might have been a laugh. You're trusting the Germans to follow the Geneva Convention? I'm trusting them to act like professional soldiers rather than criminals. It's different. She nodded, though neither was convinced by this logic. Rules mattered in war, but they mattered most when both sides agreed to follow them. And Germany had shown a flexible interpretation of international law when it suited their purposes. The first German soldier appeared in the doorway at 0647. Young, perhaps 22, wearing Wehrmacht gray-green with a rifle slung across his back. He stopped when he saw the wounded men. His eyes moved across the room, counting, assessing. Then he saw Langley and Morrison standing near the back wall. The soldier unslung his rifle. Not pointing it, just holding it ready. His expression was neutral. Professional. English, he said. British, Langley corrected. Medical personnel. These are wounded soldiers under our care. The German's English was accented but clear. You are officers? I'm a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps. She's a nurse. We stayed behind to care for these men. The soldier processed this information. Behind him, more Germans were entering the building. An officer, older, maybe 40, with better tailored uniform and a Luger pistol holstered at his waist. The officer surveyed the warehouse with practiced efficiency, then approached Langley. I am Hauptmann Schmidt, he said. You are in command here? Yes, sir. Captain James Langley. Royal Army Medical Corps. This is Nurse Catherine Morrison. We have 23 critically wounded men who require ongoing medical care. Schmidt walked between the rows of stretchers. He stopped beside Corporal Davies, looked at the stumps where his legs had been, at the blood-soaked bandages and pale skin that indicated shock and blood loss. Davies was unconscious, breathing in shallow irregular gasps. This man is dying, Schmidt said. Yes. The others? All critical. All expected to die within days. Perhaps hours for some of them. Schmidt's expression didn't change. You stayed behind for men who cannot be saved? I stayed behind because they're my patients. And because someone needed to. The German officer was quiet for a moment. He looked at Morrison then back at Langley. Something shifted in his face. Not sympathy exactly but recognition. Understanding that drew on some shared professional identity that transcended uniforms and nationalities. You will remain here, Schmidt said. You will continue to care for these men. We will provide water and basic supplies. But you are now prisoners of war. You understand this? Yes, sir. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed if you follow instructions. Do you understand this also? Yes, sir. Schmidt nodded. He issued orders in German to the soldiers behind him. They withdrew, leaving 2 guards at the entrance. The guards looked uncomfortable. They were occupying a hospital, essentially, pointing rifles at wounded men and medical staff. This wasn't the war they trained for. Morrison exhaled slowly. Well, that went better than expected. It's not over, Langley said. We're prisoners now. Everything changes. But Morrison was right. It could have been worse. They could have been shot. The wounded could have been left to die without care. The Germans could have decided that medical personnel who stayed behind were franc-tireurs, illegal combatants, subject to immediate execution. Instead they were prisoners. Protected by international law. Allowed to continue their work. The transformation happened gradually over the next hours. The warehouse, which had been a British aid station, became a German-controlled medical facility. Wehrmacht medical personnel arrived to inspect the facility. They examined the wounded men, reviewed Langley's notes, checked supplies. One German doctor, an older man with gray hair and quiet competence, spoke briefly with Langley about treatment protocols. You have done good work, the German doctor said. Under difficult circumstances. Thank you. But you know most of these men will die regardless of care? Yes. Then why stay? Langley didn't have a simple answer. Because orders said to? No, he disobeyed orders by staying. Because of medical ethics? That was closer but incomplete. Because these were his patients and he'd made promises? Partially true but still not quite accurate. Because someone had to witness it, Langley said finally. Their deaths. To make sure they didn't die alone. To make sure someone remembered that they existed. That they were more than statistics in a casualty report. The German doctor nodded slowly. Yes, I understand this. In the last war in 1918 I stayed behind in a field hospital near Cambrai when our lines collapsed. 27 German soldiers who could not be moved. I was captured by British forces. Spent 2 years as a prisoner of war. Why did you stay? The same reason you did, I think. The German doctor gestured toward the wounded men. We will send additional medical supplies. Morphine especially. Your patients will need it. Thank you. Do not thank me. I do this for them, not for you. The doctor left. Langley understood what he meant. This wasn't compassion between enemies. This was professional recognition between doctors who understood that medicine created obligations that superseded national loyalties. The German doctor would provide supplies because suffering patients deserved relief. Not because he cared about British soldiers or wanted to help the enemy. Morrison was changing bandages on Private Wheeler when Langley returned to his section. Wheeler had regained consciousness. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in days, which Langley recognized as the temporary clarity that sometimes came before death. The body's final rally before systems failed completely. Captain, Wheeler said. His voice was weak. Are we still in France? Yes, Private. Still in Dunkirk. Did everyone else evacuate? Most of them, yes. The evacuation was successful. Wheeler processed this. But not us. We stayed behind. You were too injured to move. Nurse Morrison and I stayed to care for you and the others. That was stupid, sir. Respectfully. Langley smiled. Probably. But here we are. I'm dying, aren't I? You don't have to lie anymore. Morrison paused in her bandaging. Langley met Wheeler's eyes. The private deserved honesty. Yes, Langley said. You're dying. I'm sorry. Wheeler nodded. Thought so. It doesn't hurt much anymore. That's not a good sign, is it? The morphine is helping with pain. Right. Wheeler was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you for staying, sir. For both of you. I didn't want to die alone. Or with Germans around and no one English to talk to. You're welcome, Private. Will you write to my mother? After. Tell her I wasn't scared at the end. I will. I promise. Thank you. Wheeler closed his eyes. His breathing was becoming more labored. Do you think there's a heaven, Captain? I don't know. I hope so. Me too. I'd like to see my dad again. He died when I was 12. Worked in the Manchester mills. Good man. Made those meat pies I told you about. You said your mother made those. Wheeler smiled without opening his eyes. I lied. Dad made them. Mum couldn't cook worth a damn. But don't tell her I said that. I won't. Wheeler died 3 hours later. Quietly. Morrison was with him at the end. Langley was checking on Corporal Davies when he heard her call his name. By the time he reached Wheeler's stretcher, the private was gone. Eyes closed. Face peaceful. 19 years old. They wrapped him in a blanket and carried him outside to the area where the dead were being gathered. There were bodies everywhere. British soldiers who died during the evacuation. German soldiers killed in the final advance. Civilians caught in the fighting. War reduced everyone to the same state. Corpses waiting for burial. Morrison stood beside Wheeler's body for a moment. 22 left, she said. Yes. We made the right choice, didn't we? Staying? Langley looked at the warehouse where dying men still breathed, where morphine kept pain manageable, where 2 people bore witness to suffering. I think so, he said. Ask me again in a week. But Morrison was right. They'd made the right choice. Not the militarily sound choice or the strategically correct choice or the choice that would appear justified in after-action reports. But the human choice. The choice that recognized that dying soldiers deserved more than abandonment. That medicine created obligations that didn't evaporate when circumstances became inconvenient. The transformation was complete. They were no longer British medical personnel operating behind enemy lines. They were prisoners of war operating with enemy permission. The warehouse was no longer a British aid station. It was a German-supervised facility for dying Allied soldiers. But the work remained the same. Check vitals. Change bandages. Administer morphine. Sit with men in their final hours. Bear witness. Remember names. Make sure that when death came, it came with some measure of dignity and human company. The evacuation at Dunkirk was finished. Most of the British Expeditionary Force was safe in England. Here in the warehouse, 22 men who would never see England again waited for an end that came with varying speed but inevitable certainty. And 2 people who could have escaped chose to stay and count the cost of that choice in hours and days and quiet deaths in a warehouse that smelled of blood and antiseptic and the particular odor of wounds that wouldn't heal. June 2, 1940. The 6th day. Corporal Davies died at dawn. He'd been conscious until the end, lucid enough to make jokes about the quality of German coffee the guards had brought. He told Morrison that if he'd known losing his legs would mean 6 days of terrible coffee, he'd have avoided the mine entirely. She'd laughed, which surprised both of them. Then his breathing changed. Became irregular. Stopped. Morrison sat beside his body for 10 minutes before calling Langley. Neither spoke. They developed an efficiency about death over the past week. Confirmation. Documentation. Removal. The ritual was brief because it had to be repeated frequently. 14 men had died in 6 days. 8 remained. The warehouse felt larger now, emptier. The rows of stretchers had gaps like missing teeth. Langley had started keeping a journal, writing brief notes about each man. Name. Hometown. How he'd been wounded. What he'd said in his final conscious moments. Someone needed to remember the details. The military would record names and service numbers. But Langley wanted to preserve the human pieces. The fact that Private Morrison from Liverpool had been afraid of the dark. That Sergeant Thompson from Yorkshire had sung church hymns when morphine made him delirious. That Lance Corporal Hughes from Cardiff had died holding a photograph of his fiancée. The German medical staff had been correct. Professional. They provided supplies as promised. Hauptmann Schmidt visited daily to check on conditions. He never stayed long and rarely spoke, but his presence confirmed that the Germans were honoring their obligations under the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were being treated appropriately. Wounded were receiving care. But the care couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. 8 men remained. All would die. Some within days. Others might linger for weeks. But the outcome was certain. Langley had started noticing subtle shifts in how the German guards interacted with the warehouse. Initially they'd been formal, distant, following regulations. Now some of the younger soldiers would pause to watch Morrison work, would ask quiet questions about the British wounded. One guard, a boy of perhaps 19 from Bavaria, had started bringing small supplies without being asked. Extra blankets. better quality bandages. Once, a tin of British tea he'd found somewhere in the captured stores. Why do you do this? Langley asked him. The guard's name was Klaus. He had terrible English but made sincere efforts to communicate. My brother, Klaus said. He is soldier too. In Poland last year he is wounded. Russian hospital take him. Russian doctors save his life. They are enemy but they save him. So you're repaying them by helping our wounded? Yes. How do you say, hoping? I hope someone help my brother if he is wounded again. So I help these men. Maybe God remember. Langley understood. War created strange bargains. Small kindnesses exchanged between enemies in the hope that kindness might be reciprocated somewhere else. Klaus helped British wounded because Russian doctors had helped his brother. Maybe somewhere on another front, someone would help Klaus if he was injured. The logic was circular and probably useless. But it was human. It suggested that even in war people searched for patterns of decency to cling to. Morrison had her own relationship with the German medical staff. The senior German doctor, Oberstabsarzt Werner, had started consulting with her about difficult cases. Not the British wounded, who were Morrison's responsibility, but German soldiers who'd been injured in the final assault on Dunkirk. Werner would describe symptoms, ask Morrison's opinion, discuss treatment options. She'd respond professionally, offering advice drawn from 3 years of nursing experience. They never acknowledged the absurdity of the situation. That they were technically enemies but functionally colleagues. That Morrison was a prisoner but also a consultant. That Werner could order her execution but instead sought her professional judgment about managing gangrene in a Wehrmacht private. Do you think they see us as people? Morrison asked Langley one evening. They were sitting outside the warehouse, taking advantage of relatively warm weather. Inside, the 8 remaining wounded men were sleeping, their breathing audible through the open door. The Germans? Yes. Werner, Schmidt, even young Klaus. Do they see us as human beings? Or just as enemy medical personnel who happen to be useful? Langley considered. Both, I think. We're useful, which gives us value. But I think men like Werner also recognize something shared. We're all trying to reduce suffering in a situation designed to create it. That creates a kind of professional kinship. Even though we're on opposite sides? Especially because we're on opposite sides. If we were on the same side, this would just be normal medical work. The fact that we're enemies makes the cooperation more significant. It suggests that something survives even when everything else breaks down. Morrison was quiet. Then, I hate them, you know. The Germans. For what they've done. For France, for the war, for all of it. But I can't hate Werner or Klaus or even Schmidt. They're just men doing a job. Same as us. That's the problem with war, Langley said. It requires us to hate abstractions while interacting with individuals. The German army is evil. But this specific German doctor is professional and decent. Both things are true simultaneously. How do you manage that contradiction? I don't. I just acknowledge it exists and keep working. The 8th day brought new complications. 2 German wounded were transferred to the warehouse. Space had opened as British patients died, and Wehrmacht medical facilities were overcrowded. Werner asked Langley if he could treat the German soldiers. Technically, Langley could refuse. Geneva Convention provisions were specific. Medical personnel could not be compelled to treat enemy wounded. But refusing would be petty. And Langley's oath didn't distinguish between British and German patients. A wound was a wound. Suffering was suffering. I'll treat them, Langley said. Thank you. I will ensure this is documented. Your cooperation will be noted in official records. Langley didn't care about official records. He cared about 2 German soldiers with injuries that needed treatment. One had a broken leg, poorly set, that was starting to show signs of infection. The other had a bullet wound through the shoulder that had been bandaged but not properly cleaned. Morrison helped him treat both men. The Germans watched her work with expressions of confusion. They'd expected hostility perhaps. Or indifference. Instead she was simply competent. Professional. She cleaned wounds with the same careful technique she used on British patients. Applied bandages with identical precision. Checked for signs of shock or internal bleeding without regard for nationality. The German soldier with the shoulder wound spoke some English. Why you help us? He asked Morrison. We are enemy. You're wounded, Morrison said. That makes you my patient. I don't abandon patients. But we invade your country. France isn't my country. I'm Scottish. And yes, you lot invaded France and we're fighting to stop you. But right now you're wounded and I'm a nurse. The fighting is someone else's job. The soldier didn't respond. But his expression suggested he was reconsidering assumptions about British medical personnel. Over the next days, Langley and Morrison developed a routine that encompassed both British and German wounded. They would make rounds, checking each patient regardless of uniform. They would adjust medications, change bandages, monitor for complications. The Germans improved. The British continued dying. Private Harrison, the youngest of the British wounded at 17, died on day 9. He'd been unconscious for 3 days, injured by shrapnel that had entered through his back and damaged his spine. There was nothing to be done. Morrison had kept him clean and comfortable. When he died, she cried. First time Langley had seen her break. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's unprofessional. It's human. Don't apologize. There are still 7 left. I can't afford to break down every time." "Then don't. But allow yourself these moments when they come." The German soldiers in the warehouse had witnessed Harrison's death. That evening, the soldier with the shoulder wound approached Langley. His name was Muller. He was 24, from Hamburg, a schoolteacher before the war. "I am sorry for the boy," Muller said. "He was very young." "Yes. You and the nurse, you stay with these men even though they die. Even though you could have escaped. This is..." He searched for the word. "Ehrenhaft. Honor. I think that is English word." "Thank you. In Germany we are told the British are weak. That you run from fighting. But I think this is not weak. To stay with dying men. This is not weak." Langley didn't know how to respond. Muller wasn't seeking conversation. He was revising his understanding of the enemy. Incorporating new data that contradicted previous assumptions. It was uncomfortable work. Easier to maintain the simple narrative. British are weak, Germans are strong, war is glorious. Harder to acknowledge that courage took many forms and that enemies might possess qualities worth respecting. The consequences of staying behind were becoming clearer. They would be prisoners until the war ended. That could be months or years. They would witness every death among the remaining British wounded. They would carry those memories for however long they lived. They would document names and faces and final words so that someone someday could tell families what had happened to their sons and husbands and brothers. But they would also demonstrate something that military strategists rarely considered valuable. They would show that medicine created obligations that superseded national loyalty. That caring for dying men had worth even when no strategic benefit resulted. That witnessing suffering and refusing to abandon the dying was itself a form of courage. These were difficult consequences to measure. No military medal recognized staying behind when evacuation was possible. No after-action report would praise medical personnel who chose captivity over escape. The official record would note, Captain Langley and Nurse Morrison remained in Dunkirk to treat critically wounded personnel who could not be evacuated, subsequently captured by German forces. But in that warehouse, with 7 British soldiers dying slowly and 2 German soldiers healing gradually, something was being demonstrated that transcended official records. People could choose to stay when leaving was possible. Medical personnel could honor their oaths even when doing so meant sacrifice. Enemies could recognize shared humanity even while fighting to kill each other. These consequences would ripple in ways Langley couldn't predict. Muller would return to his unit and tell other German soldiers about the British doctor and nurse who stayed behind for dying men. Klaus would remember the tea and the small kindnesses. Werner would document in official reports that British medical personnel had treated German wounded with professional competence. And 7 British soldiers would die knowing that someone cared enough to stay. That their final hours had witnesses. That they weren't just casualties of war, but human beings whose suffering mattered enough that 2 people chose captivity to provide comfort. The mathematics of war said abandoning the dying was correct. The mathematics of war measured success in divisions saved and territories captured and strategic objectives achieved. By those measurements, staying behind made no sense. But there were other mathematics. Harder to quantify but just as real. The mathematics of keeping promises. Of honoring oaths. Of refusing to accept that some suffering was acceptable collateral damage. By those measurements, staying made perfect sense. August 15, 1943. 3 years later. Stalag 8B, prisoner of war camp in Silesia. Langley stood in the camp hospital barracks watching rain hammer against windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, listening to the coughs of prisoners with tuberculosis in the ward behind him, feeling the particular exhaustion that came from 3 years of captivity and inadequate food and the slow grinding weight of time that seemed to have no end. He was 35 years old now. He'd been a prisoner for 1,175 days. Not that he counted. Everyone counted. The camp hospital treated primarily British and Commonwealth prisoners, though some French and Polish soldiers passed through as well. Langley was the senior medical officer. He had 2 other doctors, 5 nurses including Morrison, and 30 orderlies with varying degrees of medical training. They operated in conditions that would have been condemned in any civilian hospital. Inadequate supplies, overcrowding, no proper surgical facilities, barely enough medicine to treat basic infections. But they operated. They treated wounds and illnesses. They saved some men and watched others die. They maintained medical standards in circumstances designed to make medical standards impossible. Morrison still worked beside him. 3 years of captivity had changed her. Made her harder in some ways, more compassionate in others. She'd learned to speak serviceable German, which helped when negotiating with camp authorities for supplies. She'd learned to stretch medicine that should treat 10 patients to somehow treat 30. She'd learned the exact tone of voice that would convince a dying man that things weren't as bad as they felt. They rarely spoke about Dunkirk. The 7 British soldiers had died over the course of 3 weeks. Langley and Morrison had documented each death, wrapped each body, attended each burial. Then they'd been transferred to this camp along with thousands of other British prisoners. But what happened in that warehouse had followed them. Other prisoners knew the story. The doctor and nurse who stayed behind when they could have escaped. It created a kind of authority. When Langley said a treatment was necessary, prisoners believed him. When Morrison insisted on hygiene protocols even in the filthy conditions of the camp, prisoners complied. The German camp medical officer, a man named Steiner, also knew the story. He'd read the reports from Dunkirk. Knew that Langley had treated German wounded. That Morrison had maintained professional standards regardless of a patient's nationality. This knowledge created a strange dynamic. Steiner provided better supplies than he was required to by Geneva Convention. He allowed Langley more autonomy in operating the hospital barracks. He occasionally looked the other way when British doctors stretched regulations. You could have been safe in England, Steiner had said once. Teaching at a medical school perhaps. Practicing in a proper hospital. Why did you stay? Because those men needed someone. But they died anyway. Yes, but they didn't die alone. That mattered to them. It mattered to their families. It matters to me. Steiner had nodded. I was at Verdun in 1916. I saw many men die. The ones who died surrounded by friends seemed to have an easier death than those who died alone in shell holes. Perhaps you are correct. Perhaps the witnessing matters. Now, 3 years later, Langley understood that staying in Dunkirk had been preparation for this. For running a hospital in impossible conditions. For making decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't with inadequate resources. For maintaining hope and professional standards when both seemed pointless. He also understood that the decision had changed him in ways he was still discovering. Before the war, medicine had been a profession. A way to help people and earn a living. Now it was something else. A vocation. A calling that created obligations that didn't end when circumstances became difficult. Morrison found him at the window. Steiner approved the request for additional bandages, she said. They'll arrive next week. That's good. We still need more sulfa powder. And morphine. Always morphine. I'll raise it with him again. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Do you ever regret it? Staying in Dunkirk? Langley considered. No. Do you? No. But I wonder sometimes what my life would be like if we'd evacuated. If I'd gone back to Edinburgh. Worked in a civilian hospital. Married perhaps. Would you have been happy? I don't know. Probably. But I wouldn't be who I am now. And who are you now? Morrison smiled. It was tired but genuine. Someone who stayed. Someone who chose to witness suffering rather than escape it. I think that matters more than being happy. She was right. The legacy of that decision wasn't about personal happiness or professional advancement. It was about becoming the kind of person who could look at impossible choices and choose based on values rather than convenience. Other prisoners had made similar choices. Men who shared food when they were starving. Who organized classes and concerts and religious services in a camp designed to break spirits. Who maintained dignity and humanity in circumstances intended to destroy both. The war would end eventually. Germany was losing, though the process was slow and the cost catastrophic. Langley would return to England. Morrison would go back to Scotland. They would resume normal lives. But they would carry Dunkirk with them. Not as trauma exactly, though there were elements of that. But as confirmation that medical oaths meant something. That staying with dying men had value even when no military benefit resulted. That bearing witness to suffering was itself a form of resistance against the machinery of war that reduced human beings to casualty statistics. The 7 men who died in that warehouse had names. Families. Stories that ended in a converted building that smelled of antiseptic and blood while their comrades evacuated to safety. Langley had written to their families after the war ended. Told them their sons and husbands had not died alone. That medical personnel had stayed to provide comfort. That someone remembered. He received letters back. Gratitude mixed with grief. Relief that there had been some measure of dignity in the final hours. Questions about last words and final moments that Langley answered as honestly as he could. The military never acknowledged the decision officially. There was no medal for staying behind. No commendation for choosing captivity over escape. The official record noted that Langley and Morrison had been captured while treating wounded personnel. Nothing more. But the unofficial recognition mattered more. Medical personnel throughout the British Army knew the story. It became an example taught in training. Not as a model to replicate necessarily, but as a demonstration that medical ethics sometimes required sacrifice. That the Hippocratic Oath created obligations that didn't end when circumstances became inconvenient. Years later, Langley would be asked to speak at medical conferences about wartime experiences. He would talk about the warehouse. About the 23 dying men. About the decision to stay. Audiences would ask why he'd done it. What had compelled that choice? Langley never had a simple answer. It wasn't heroism. Heroes charged machine guns or led assaults. He just stayed in a building and administered morphine. It wasn't martyrdom. Martyrs died for causes. He'd survived and gone on to treat thousands more patients. It was simply recognition that medicine created obligations. That when you took an oath to reduce suffering, that obligation didn't evaporate when following it became costly. That bearing witness to death and providing comfort in final hours had value regardless of strategic considerations. These were difficult concepts to explain to people who hadn't experienced war, who hadn't faced the choice between escape and staying behind, who couldn't understand why anyone would choose captivity when freedom was possible. But other veterans understood. Other medical personnel who'd faced similar choices recognized the logic. Not military logic or strategic logic but human logic. The recognition that some actions mattered precisely because they served no practical purpose except to affirm that human beings possessed value beyond their utility to military objectives. Morrison eventually married a Scottish doctor she met after the war. They had 2 children. She continued nursing until she was 70, working in the same Edinburgh hospital where she trained. When she died at 83, her obituary mentioned that she'd been a prisoner of war. That she'd stayed in Dunkirk to care for dying soldiers when evacuation was possible. Langley never married. He returned to practice in London, taught at medical schools, published papers on wartime medicine. When he died at 78, former students spoke at his funeral. They talked about his emphasis on medical ethics. His insistence that oaths mattered even when honoring them required sacrifice. His belief that witnessing suffering was itself valuable. But the real legacy wasn't in obituaries or formal recognition. It was in the smaller moments. The German Dr. Werner, who after the war became a vocal advocate for medical neutrality in armed conflict, citing his experience with British medical personnel at Dunkirk as evidence that professional ethics could survive even war. Klaus, the young German guard, who became a physician after the war and made it his practice to treat all patients with the same care regardless of background, remembering the tea and blankets he'd brought to dying British soldiers. Muller, the soldier with the shoulder wound, who returned to teaching and told his students that courage took many forms, including the courage to stay with dying men when escape was possible. And the families of the 23 British soldiers who died in that warehouse, who received letters explaining that their sons had not died alone, that medical personnel had stayed, that someone remembered names and final words and the small human details that official casualty reports omitted. These were the ripples, small, difficult to measure, but real. The warehouse in Dunkirk was demolished in 1944 during Allied bombing raids. Nothing remains of the building now. The location is a parking lot serving a shopping center. No plaque marks where 7 dying men spent their final hours. No memorial acknowledges that 2 people chose captivity over escape. But the choice echoes. In medical school ethics courses they use the story as an example. In discussions about the obligations created by professional oaths. In the quiet knowledge among medical personnel that sometimes the right choice is the one that makes no practical sense but affirms that human beings possess value beyond their utility. The man who volunteered to stay behind wasn't actually one man. It was 2 people. A doctor and a nurse who looked at dying soldiers and decided that bearing witness mattered more than personal safety. Who understood that medicine created obligations that didn't end when circumstances became difficult. Who chose to count the cost in days of captivity rather than abandonments of principle. Their names were James Langley and Catherine Morrison. For 6 days in May 1940, they cared for dying men in a warehouse in Dunkirk while an army evacuated around them. Then they spent 3 years as prisoners of war. Then they returned to normal lives. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had stayed when leaving was possible. That they had honored their oaths when breaking them would have been understandable. That they had borne witness to suffering and provided comfort in final hours and refused to accept that some human beings were expendable casualties whose deaths didn't require acknowledgement. This was their legacy. Not medals or commendations. But the quiet knowledge that when faced with an impossible choice, they had chosen based on values rather than convenience. And that choice, made in a warehouse that no longer exists, echoed in ways they never fully understood but that mattered nonetheless. Because someone had to stay. Someone had to witness. Someone had to affirm that dying soldiers deserved more than abandonment. They stayed. They witnessed. They affirmed. And the war, which reduced human beings to statistics and strategic objectives, could not erase the fact that for 23 British soldiers, death came with dignity and human company because 2 people refused to accept that military necessity justified every sacrifice. That refusal, quiet and unheralded, was itself a victory. Small, difficult to measure, but absolute.